Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. There is a saying, mighty oak trees from tiny acorns grow, or tiny acorns lead to mighty oak trees. I mean, you can say it any way you want, but you get the point. Something small produces something big. So it is with Shostakovich's Symphony No. 8. It's one of his biggest symphonies. It lasts about an hour. It has 5 ample movements. And, more to the point, it's one of his darkest and most intense pieces, created in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when he thought he could get away with something. It depicted the horrors of war. It's also the first symphony of his that anyone heard that ended quietly. The fourth, of course, ended quietly, but that wasn't premiered until the 1960s. That was withdrawn when the whole Lady Macbeth of Mravinsky scandal began. And the Fifth Symphony ended in, well, triumph. The Sixth ended in high spirits. The Seventh ended in triumph. And the Eighth, it ends softly, dying off into infinity. Shostakovich composed many quiet endings that die away into infinity. They could go on, tick-tock, 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 forever. And the Eighth is one of them. The Fourth is another one. In fact, the ending of the Eighth really recalls that of the Fourth Symphony. And the other ones are those percussive, that thing, that go on forever, such as at the end of the 15th Symphony or the Second Cello Concerto. Shostakovich gazing out into space. There is no consolation, just soft, quiet emptiness and mystery. And that is how the Eighth Symphony ends. And that, of course, got him into a little bit of trouble, because that was not considered triumphantly heroic enough, especially to celebrate the Soviet victory after World War II. But now we don't have to worry about that. We just have to worry about great performances of Symphony No. 8, for this is one of Shostakovich's very greatest. And as I said, it's a huge work, but it's all based on teensy, tiny little motives. It's so marvelous. There are a whole bunch of symphonies that essentially could grow out of nothing. The most famous is probably Bruckner's Eighth, which is, the entire symphony is based on a grace note, essentially, or an upbeat, whatever you want to call it. Every single movement begins the same way, with da-dum. That's it. That's the whole thematic substance of Bruckner's Eighth Symphony. Or there's Rachmaninoff's First. Every single movement begins da-da-da-da, like that. Well, Shostakovich's Eighth isn't quite that simplistic, but it's very, very close. It's extremely close. The whole symphony is based on the opening gesture in the strings that you hear in the first minute of music. And that gesture contains, 2 or 3 motives. It depends on how you count them. And they're going to really determine the entire thematic substance of the symphony, which is transformed in so many fabulous and ingenious ways. You just can't believe it. It's absolutely fabulous. The opening string thing, dum, ba-dum. Okay, there's that 3-note one. Bum, ba-dum. It couldn't be easier, right? And then you can turn it around. You can turn it upside down. In fact, it turns upside down. It goes ba-dum, ba-dum. So, bum, ba-dum, turn it upside down, and it goes the other way. There's that motif. And if you add the note before the upside down one, ba-dum, ba-dum, you get another motive that's used in the symphony. And then the first violins come in with the principal theme, and that is going to serve us quite well also. Anyway, those are the things I just want you to pay attention to. And I sang them to you because I can, because they're easy. And, I sing things that aren't easy, but these are really easy, and you can't miss them. But I want to play it for you. And as usual, I have this fantastic Naxos series with Vasily Petrenko and the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. And so I can play you excerpts, and I want you to hear just about the opening paragraph, the opening gesture. It lasts, about a minute. And just pay attention to those ideas because they're repeated several times in the course of this thing with the violin theme on top. So here is the opening. Listen for bum, ba-dum, and then ba-dum, ba-dum, and just dum, ba-dum, and then the violin tune on top. Can't forget it. It's so simple, so deliciously simple. These are our little acorns. Here you go. Right? I wasn't kidding. It's really there, self-evident, right? Okay, so the first movement is this huge, long, 25, 26, 27 minute long monster piece. It is extremely closely related in structure and theme to the first movement of Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, only it's bigger and longer and darker. Like the first movement of the Fifth Symphony, it is also monothematic. In other words, that opening gesture, that three note bum ba-dum, is that's all it is. The second theme, ya da da ya da da da. It's just a slight variation of that opening idea. And so it is also in the Fifth Symphony. It's fascinating how classical Shostakovich is in his construction of these enormously long movements. I mean, it's really a marathon movement, but it's very, very, very simple in basic concept. So now that's all you need to know about the first movement. For the rest of the time, you just listen as it takes you on this like hell ride through this unbelievably tense, gripping, dark, brooding, volcanic, unbelievably tormented development section with this colossal explosion at the recapitulation and the elegiac English horn solo right afterwards, which leads right back to the second subject, and then a long coda as it all sinks back into darkness. Oh God, it's great. It is so great. Now, the second movement is a scherzo, and it's based on the first three notes. Dum bum bum. That's all you need to know. Here is the opening of the second movement. Just remember that. Dum bum 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 bum. I mean, that's all it is. You're just not going to believe how ingenious Shostakovich is. He gets so much expression and so much color and so much variety out of these little doopy three notes. It's just, I just love talking about geniuses. They make my job so easy. They really do. That's what genius does. You know, you're supposed to think that big, long works are supposed to be terribly abstruse and complicated, but the truth is, the larger the work is, chances are the simpler it's going to be, because the composer, if he isn't a jerk, wants you to follow it. So in order to follow it over these enormous time spans, he has to make sure that the basic ideas get into your head and stick there. And that's exactly what Shostakovich does in this symphony. That's one of the things that makes him such a great composer. So let's listen to the opening of the second movement. Bum, bum, bum. That's all. Here it is. last three movements are all joined. They play as a continuous chunk, which actually lasts about as long as the first movement. So it's a very well-balanced piece as well. You have two big, long, thematic movement-type complexes with a scherzo in the middle. That's basically how it works. And that is a structure, by the way, which is identical, virtually identical to that of the Fourth Symphony, which is two big movements with a scherzo in the middle, although in the Eighth, Shostakovich divides the big, long third part into three separate movements by designation, although they play all the way through. It's interesting to note, by the way, that none of Shostakovich's symphonies have the same form. He never repeated himself formally from one symphony to the next. It's another one of the wonderful attributes of his genius. And this is a deliberate thing. He clearly wanted to do something different each time he wrote a symphony. So the third movement is the toccata. And if you remember our talk about the Fourth Symphony, that also had a toccata, actually two of them, in the last movement. And this toccata is absolutely a pulverizing, evil, malevolent ride to the abyss, to quote Berlioz from The Damnation of Faust. But the interesting thing is that the opening theme of that toccata, bum, 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 it's doing that. That, my friends, is, of course, the other version of the opening motive. Remember, bum, ba-dum, and then there's ba-dum, ba-dum. Well, just even the notes out, even the rhythm out. Bum, 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 bum. That's it. There's your toccata. And then, of course, on top of that repeated business, you get these little woodwind screechy things. That's all they are. It's just wah-boom. And then, of course, it expands and goes da-da-dum, which is our dum-ba-dum, the three-note one on top. And out of that, Shostakovich builds this unbelievably scary, menacing, mechanical, evil movement with a fabulously cool trio section that's a militant, heroic trumpet solo that's trying to be kind of chipper and definitely of a triumphant military character. But even that gets obliterated by the toccata. So anyway, here is the opening of the toccata. Now, this toccata, after the trumpet solo, when it comes back, goes completely crazy. I mean, the toccata theme is hammered out by the timpani. Oh, God, is that fun. Bum, 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 bum. You know, it's a timpanist dream. It's great fun, and rises to this unbelievably insane climax that simply self-destructs. I mean, it's like nuclear bombs falling. Kaboom! Pash! Crash! Oh, it's fabulous. And that leads to the fourth movement. Now, the fourth movement is a passacaglia, and the theme of the passacaglia arises out of the huge climax at the end of the toccata. It's a huge unison brass theme that comes out. Now, what is a passacaglia? We've talked about it, I think, before. I don't know. I don't care. We'll do it again. A passacaglia is very simple. It is a series of variations on top of a repeated bass line. So you have a bass line, a theme, underneath everything that goes, it repeats however many times the composer wants. And on top of that, you do something else. Now, the actual passacaglia theme does not have to always remain in the bass. It can move up and down through the parts and all that, but it has to be present in some form or another. But this isn't just your garden variety passacaglia. No. Shostakovich has a fabulous expressive trick up his sleeve that makes it not just formally fascinating, but expressively devastating. And I mean devastating. This is music descriptive of shell shock. It is numbness, it is stasis, it's haunting and drifting seemingly almost without purpose, but through one sort of desolate scenario after another. It is utter desolation, unbelievably sad and gripping music. It plays for about 12 minutes, and it just so happens that the bass line, the Passacaglia theme, is repeated 12 times in this movement, and that's the big, noisy theme that comes out of the climax of the toccata. Bum, 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 bum. Now, the Passacaglia theme is audibly based on the opening of the symphony. The whole opening of the symphony, the motto and the main theme on the violins that came on top of that original bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. Then the first violins come in with da-dum, ba-da-da, that business. That audibly gives rise to the Passacaglia theme. It's just a variation of that. And you can play them one after the other and, just sort of confirm that for yourself. But the thing that makes this Passacaglia so emotionally devastating, so totally gripping, is this. Normally, a Passacaglia theme will take 8 bars. Usually they're 8-bar themes. That's sort of normal in music. And each variation each variation is each repetition of the Passacaglia theme, is also 8 bars or 16 bars. However much the composer stretches it out or contracts it, that's what it's going to be. So the top and the bottom are aligned. But that's not what Shostakovich does. Shostakovich's Passacaglia theme is 9 bars. It has an extra bar, which you don't really notice when you're listening to it. You don't feel that it's, you're counting measures. You're not. But what happens is, as a result of that, is that the phrasing of the music on top of this 9-bar Passacaglia, some of which is quite regular, that is, it's nice 8-bar phrasings, it means that the top and the bottom are misaligned. And that's what you need to notice. What happens is that the bottom goes drifting along, repeating and repeating and repeating, while the top is doing its thing. And it changes too. It has several solos and a few melodies and a fascinating episode with flutter-tonguing flutes. That's where you sort of blow into the flute and go like this, and it makes a very tremolo sort of sound on the flutes. It's a fascinatingly haunting and delicate sound. It does all kinds of cool things. There's a clarinet solo, there's a horn solo, but all of that is happening on top of this endlessly cycling bass line that doesn't match up with what's going on top. So the result has this disturbing feeling of being at once completely static, but also troubled. It doesn't line up correctly. And the result of that is it's like no other music you'll ever hear. It truly is. It is the music of shock, of benumbed desolation. And it is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And Shostakovich achieves it, in such a simple way, by having this bass line and the stuff that's happening on top, sort of two ships passing in the night. They never quite meet up. But then finally, the whole thing comes to the end on a C major chord, a simple C major chord, and we come to the finale. And the finale is based on... Did I play you the Passacaglia theme? Wait a minute. Let me play you the Passacaglia theme, just so you know what it is. Here it is. Yeah, that's the Passacaglia theme. And as you can hear, it's clearly based on the first movement opening. Now, the finale, after that C major chord, begins with a bassoon solo, and that is based on the upside down version of the initial motive. Not the one that went bum, ba-dum, but the one that goes dum, ba-dum, or in this case, da-da-dum, just like that. Da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-dum. And that gets repeated like 30 trillion times. It's built into the theme. Absolutely wonderful. And we don't have to get into the form of the finale, which is a sonata rondo that's just extraordinary. But what happens in the finale is that the huge, big climax of the first movement with the inverted theme comes back and destroys what fragile attempt at happiness had been going on in the finale. And the result is just the most fabulously accurate, expressive depiction of exhaustion, peaceful exhaustion that you will ever hear in music. It's not, strictly speaking, unhappy. It's simply it's not despair. It's just tired, terribly tired, and bittersweet. It's not an unhappy ending. It's a wistful ending more than anything else, I would think. It's just this idea of a memory, a ghost of faded happiness. So let me play you the opening of the finale, just so you get a sense of how that tune goes based on the other version, the bum 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 version of our fabulous three-note motive. And that, my friends, is all you need to know about Shostakovich's Eighth Symphony. To listen to this enormous symphony, you know how it's constructed. It's fabulously well constructed. You know what it's based on, with melodic gems, the seeds from which the mighty oak tree is going to grow. And so there's nothing else but to just turn you loose and go crazy. Now let's talk about recordings. Of course, I just mentioned Petrenko on Naxos. First rate, absolutely first rate, fabulous, well recorded, wonderfully played. There's a terrific performance in every way. And as usual, by the way, as I go through these, they're in no particular order till we get to the end, the last three, let's say, which are kind of favorites of mine. But this symphony has been very, very well served on disc. It really has. So we don't have to worry too much. After Petrenko, Rozhdestvensky. This is with the USSR Ministry of Culture Symphony Orchestra. If you can still find it, it was on Melodiya. This is the RCA Melodiya one that came out, but it doesn't make any difference. It is absolutely recorded in ear-splitting, laceratingly tormented digital sound. It's a classic digital Russian spectacular. It is very tiring. It is an oral ordeal. It truly is to listen to, but it is one powerful and pulverizing performance. It really, really is. So that's a lot of fun. But like I said, for some people, it just may sound too crude and too brash and too glaring and too screechy. And I wouldn't blame you for feeling that way. Also excellent. This is Maris Jansons. This is with the Pittsburgh Symphony. And it's as wonderful for the Pittsburgh Symphony as it is for Maris Jansons, who is a very, very fine Shostakovich conductor. It was one of the composers. He really, really did well. And I really enjoy this eighth. It's first class, absolutely first class. And boy, does Pittsburgh play. They sound just fabulous, as they usually do. It's always such a wonderful treat to hear Pittsburgh show up on one of these things, because, you know, Jansons was the music director in Pittsburgh for a long time, but there weren't that many recordings made, because that was after the period when the classical music industry had completely imploded and all hell was breaking loose and no one had any money. And so really great that we have the Shostakovich Eighth with Jansons in Pittsburgh. Also, surprisingly good, really first class, is this sucker. This is Joel Levy in Atlanta on Telarc. How many people remember this? He did the 10th as well. He did some very, very good Shostakovich. And the Atlanta Symphony sounds marvelous, and the sonics are absolutely spectacular. So it goes very well. You know, one of the things about the eighth is that as long as you don't underplay the climaxes, and as long as you get the flow, that weird passacaglia, and you don't die in the finale. I mean, okay, let's face it. As long as you don't screw it up, that's a generic comment. It's going to be wonderful. But what I mean is, it's a symphony that seems to be done well because most of the people who do it, it's kind of like Mahler's Ninth. They understand the seriousness of it, and so they don't underplay it, and they don't take it, for granted. It usually gets the extra effort that it needs to be deeply, deeply, expressively moving, and pretty sonically spectacular. And this one, speaking of not sonically spectacular, no, not at all. This is Kirill Kondrashin. I mean, Kondrashin's Shostakovich cycle is de rigueur. It's a fabulous cycle, noteworthy for its really quick tempos. The first movement here is, 23 minutes? I think that's like the fastest ever done, or one of them. Most people are at least 25 to 27. Not that it makes a huge difference, but this is a blisteringly exciting Shostakovich Eighth in very mediocre, grotty, Russian quasi-stereo sound. There's nothing to be done for it, It's an important performance, and it's a very, very powerful performance. You just wish it sounded better. I mean, and it's such a shame. But one that really does sound fantastic, which is on the slow side, but really gripping, is Mark Wigglesworth. This is the Bis cycle, which is really first class. This just got boxed up. This is recently out, and it really is. I've been listening to it again in bits and pieces, and it really, really is fine. The only performance in here that I think isn't absolutely at the top of its game is the Leningrad. And that's just, it's not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just not quite as intense as the other performances in here, But there are some absolutely fabulous things in here, and the eighth is definitely one of them. Very, 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 very fine. A classic eighth that we all knew and loved back in the day was this one, Previn. Previn with the London Symphony. He did it twice with the London Symphony. Once on EMI, now Warner, and once on Deutsche Grammophon. Now, the Deutsche Grammophon performance is a little bit better sonically, but it's also considerably slower. And this is his first one, and it has that freshness and that angst and the necessary eruptiveness that you have to have in this symphony, and I really like this performance. This is one that a lot of us in the West imprinted on, because for a long time, if you couldn't get Kondrashin, there were only Melodiya recordings, and there were not 400 versions of the Eighth Symphony that you could dig into, and so we got Previn, and we were lucky to have it, let me tell you. What's this? Oh, this one is also shockingly fine. Really, really first class. Leonard Slatkin. He did some terrific Shostakovich too. His fourth is also excellent. He did so much great work in St. Louis, and no one really gives him any credit for it. And we badly need a complete Slatkin St. Louis box. Remember, we had the American box, which of course left out one of the most important things, like the Barber disc or whatever it was. Stupid. But we really could use a Slatkin and St. Louis box, because there are wonderful, wonderful things in that repertoire. I mean, he was on the top of his form, and he had the orchestra playing on the top of its form. And this Shostakovich Eighth is as powerful and exciting as any out there. beautifully done. And one of the nice things about Slatkin is that his tempos are always very flowing and natural sounding. He manages to skate over the dead spots and get to the good stuff. And it's always very effective. It's particularly true in this performance of the Eighth. Now comes a sort of a toughie that we need to talk about. Mravinsky. Now, this is the 1982 live Shostakovich Eighth. There are several. There was one from the 40s, like around the time of the premiere. There's one from, I think, 1960. There's one that was recorded on BBC, classics released on BBC, which was very good with an audience that does nothing but cough. The audience coughs a bit here, too. These live things, I am not the fan of Mravinsky that so many others are, I have to tell you. And the reason is just simple. It's just crappy sound and coughing people. The orchestra's marvelous. Mravinsky is marvelous. The intensity of the climax is virtually unparalleled. I grant all of that. But, this is an hour-long symphony. And there is so much more than the ear-splitting din that the orchestra can make in the loud bits. You have to get through the whole thing. And if there's constant disruption and disturbance or grotty sound throughout all the slow bits, it's an ordeal to listen to. You recognize the greatness of the performance, but you'd be kidding yourself to think that you're going to pull it out and play it every time you want to hear the Eighth or recommend it to someone as a first version. I can't do any of those things. Now, this Eighth was released on at least 4 or 5 different labels. At one point or another, Philips had it. And the Philips recording was famous because it was pitched a half a tone sharp. Instead of a symphony in C minor, it was in C sharp minor. So it could have been in our talk on music and the emotional qualities of different keys for C sharp minor, accidentally. But this version on Russian All-Star or Icon or whatever the heck it was called, Russian disc, it did one too. This was corrected pitch-wise, and it still sounds kind of scruffy and woolly. And this one, which is easily available, this is on alto, was very carefully corrected for pitch, and some of the noise and stuff was removed. It sounds pretty damn good for its source, for what it was. I mean, the Philips one sounds brightest of all because it's, it's also faster because the pitch is higher and it's all moving more quickly. But it's a great Shostakovich Eighth, no question about it. It's a great Shostakovich Eighth. But I find when I do these talks, I go through all these performances, and I don't have to listen to all of them, but I sample all of them, just to make sure my memory is not completely evaporated. And I have to say, Mravinsky is not the iconic great thing that I think his reputation would lead us to believe. However wonderful it is, and he knew Shostakovich, and all of that stuff. And of course, Leningrad was legendary, and it was "you will play like I want," or "I will send you to the gulag." I mean, all of that's true. All of that's true. But I think some of these other ones offer a more rewarding listening experience. And that's just me. You may disagree, but there you are. Okay, let's see what we got here. We're down to our last 4. Okay, Sanderling. Yeah, Sanderling with the Berlin Symphony Orchestra. This Sanderling was the king of grim. I mean, he made Otto Klemperer sound absolutely cheerful by comparison. I mean, talk about grim and gripping. Sanderling does a terrific Shostakovich Eighth. It is exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting. When it's over, you're just like, oh, God, yeah. Mm-hmm. It is really, really tough. No nonsense, unapologetic, unsentimental, and totally, completely emotionally draining. It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. All of his Shostakovich is really, it's really absolutely fabulous. He also knew Shostakovich. Remember, he was in the Soviet Union at the time, so he's just as authentic an exponent of the symphony as Mravinsky is. He really is, in terms of knowing the composer and what he wanted and what he intended and all that stuff. So yes, Sanderling is worth considering. He's on Berlin Classics, but we're down to our final 3. First, Nimi Järvi. Yeah, baby. Ooh, yes. Yes. Järvi is just one of those take no prisoners, hell for leather, pedal to the metal, scorching, smoking, flambeing, all the cooking metaphors, poaching, parboiling, deep frying, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. It's just great, fabulously recorded with, the Scottish National Orchestra just going for it, as they did in all of these Shostakovich recordings with Järvi. It's just a marvelous, marvelous performance, and it's one of my favorites, just for sheer excitement, but not at the expense of the more lyrical or the quieter moments. What Järvi always did, and I have to give him credit for it, was keep the thing moving. I mean, the Passacaglia, the Largo, is here about 10 minutes. Quite often it's closer to 12. I think 10 minutes is just fine. I mean, 12 is Sanderling is, what is Sanderling doing here? Yeah, no, he's 10 minutes too. See, he gets it. The unsentimental guy, he really gets it. Some of the other people here are a bit longer. Well, they're about 10. We're doing okay. Let me see here. Yeah, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. There's always that possibility as well. But I really think that it's a wonderful performance. Let me just leave it there, because I'm just going to make a fool of myself if I keep going on about it. It's great. Next. Haitink. Yes, believe it or not, Haitink. You may think I would think, no, Haitink always seems to be at his best in pieces that require a little bit of strategic thinking to get the flow just right. And he really does. He's a literalist as an interpreter. He doesn't minimize anything in this music, though. You can be a literalist without underplaying. And that's the point. He never underplays this music, not for a second. He's got the Concertgebouw in full cry. I mean, the trombones and the toccata, when they get the theme, which is a real virtuoso passage for the whole trombone section, they're like, it's very, very difficult. And wow, do they play the living daylights out of it. He really gets top-notch results from this great, great, great orchestra, and the performance is thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling, and it just sits well. Everything balances beautifully. The whole piece has shape, and real lyrical beauty too. We don't give Shostakovich credit for being beautiful, but he quite often is. And in this movement, in this symphony, particularly, there's not just the first movement, but in the finale, the main theme, when it comes in on the strings, is this sort of wan, the wan as in pale, just sort of sigh, ya da 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 da, and it has this, it's like a breath of relief. That's what it is. It's just a sigh of relief that the nightmare is finally over. Except it's not. It comes back. And after that, it stops pretending and says, okay, the nightmare isn't over, but you just hear it. You hear it with such, it's a breath of fresh air. The whole performance is. It really is. It's the opposite of morbid. And so many performances of the symphony can simply emphasize all the darkness. And Haitink doesn't stint on darkness. There's plenty of darkness. But also its opposite. And the result, I think, is just an emotionally incredibly satisfying experience. So kudos to Haitink, one of the best things he ever did, seriously. And speaking of best things that someone ever did, however, my favorite, the one that just is very special to me, and I think it may be a bit of a sleeper, but it's Rostropovich with the National Symphony Orchestra of Washington, D.C. This is the performance. You may recall there was a video that of Rostropovich's return to Russia. And, he was on tour with the orchestra, and he took this symphony with them. And I think they were very, very well rehearsed. They were absolutely ready to do it. And this symphony really meant something special to Rostropovich. And he made sure that the orchestra was able to do it. Rostropovich gets very little props as a conductor quite often. And he could be, sometimes I saw him do a Mahler too that was stunning. I mean, he could be great. But he was also one of those very sort of spontaneous musicians who could have his on or off days. And quite a bit of this Shostakovich, the stuff that he did in the UK particularly, is really dull. But this eighth is fantastic. fantastic. What I think it really has, where it really nails it, is in the second half, the last three movements, especially the toccata, which goes a little bit slower than it usually goes, but with absolute mechanical precision and malevolence. It is because Rostropovich gets them to play it with a totally inexpressive mechanical evil. I mean, that's what it is. It's bum 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 bum. It's rigid and it's nasty, and he just understands the intent behind the music. And as a result of that, when we get to the Passacaglia, it's all the more devastating, and the finale all the more. There's all the more relief until the big climax in the middle of it. I mean, it's all the more effective as a result. It's the most convincing emotional journey in the last three movements that I think I've ever heard in this symphony. It is exceptional. And the first two are not slouches by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a lot to be said for a performance of a big, long symphony that gets stronger and better as it goes, and that does not let you down at the end, even though it's very, very quiet. It's a great performance. It truly is. I think it's the highlight of his Shostakovich cycle. Well, that and the 14th with his wife. That's also just, insane. But this eighth is really a special performance. And I mean, I love Haitink. Yes, I love Haitink. And I love Järvi. And I love Sanderling. Oh, and I like Slatkin. And I like all these. They're all great. They're all terrific. But I just think this one has a certain special quality. And I really want to call out Rostropovich as someone who was so dedicated to Shostakovich all his life and who deserves some credit where credit is due, because he's not likely to get it unless we take special notice, I think. So, Rostropovich in Shostakovich's Eighth. And that, my friends, is the story of this magnificent oak tree of a symphony, which grows from teeny tiny little acorns. It's a musical marvel. Keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy.